You are standing at the edge of an empire that once seemed unstoppable. At its height, the Ottoman Empire was not just powerful, it was everywhere. From the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from the Balkans to North Africa, it ruled over 3 continents with confidence and authority. For centuries, it had been the center of gravity between East and West, shaping trade, politics, and war. To many in Europe, it felt less like a rival and more like an inevitable force of history. And then came the year 1683. This was the moment when everything appeared to align for one final push. The Ottoman army, vast and disciplined, marched toward Vienna, the heart of Central Europe. If Vienna fell, the road ahead would open wide. The balance of power across the continent could shift in ways no one could fully predict. From the Ottoman perspective, this was not just another campaign. It was the logical continuation of centuries of expansion. But what you need to understand is this: empires rarely recognize their own limits. The Siege of Vienna was not just a battle over a city. It was a test of how far the Ottoman system could stretch before it began to strain. For years, the empire had grown through strength, organization, and adaptability. Yet by 1683, subtle cracks had already begun to form beneath the surface. They were not obvious in the size of the army or the ambition of its leaders. They were hidden in the way the empire governed itself, in how it responded to a changing world. When the siege failed, it did not look like the end. There was no sudden collapse, no immediate disintegration. The empire still stood, still powerful, still vast. But something had changed. Vienna marked the furthest point the Ottomans would ever reach into Europe, not just geographically, but symbolically. From that moment forward, the direction slowly began to reverse. The expansion that had defined the empire for centuries gave way to something quieter and more dangerous: a long, gradual decline. And here is the truth that often gets overlooked. The fall of the Ottoman Empire did not begin with its final defeat centuries later. It began here, at the height of its ambition, when it could no longer push forward. You are not watching the end of an empire yet. You are watching the moment it stops growing. Now you are inside Vienna in the summer of 1683, and everything feels like it is about to break. Outside the walls, an Ottoman army of around 150,000 men surrounds the city. This is not a distant threat. It is immediate, overwhelming, and relentless. For weeks, the defenders inside Vienna, barely 15,000 soldiers supported by civilians, hold on under constant pressure. Food runs low, disease spreads. Every day, Ottoman engineers dig tunnels beneath the walls, planting explosives to tear the city open from below. If you were there, you would not be thinking about grand strategy or empire. You would be thinking about survival. Because if Vienna falls, the consequences would reach far beyond this city. It would open a path into Central Europe, shifting the balance of power across the continent. For many watching at the time, this was not just a siege. It was a moment that could redefine Europe itself. But history does not always follow the direction of momentum. On September 12, everything changes. A relief army arrives, formed by a coalition of European forces. At its center is King John III, Sobieski of Poland. What follows is not a slow turning of the tide, but a sudden, decisive udar. From the hills above Vienna, thousands of cavalry begin their descent. Among them are the Polish winged hussars, heavy cavalry known for their discipline and shock power. You can almost hear it before you see it. The sound of hooves building, the ground shaking, the line of riders accelerating down the slope. This becomes one of the largest cavalry charges ever recorded. When they hit the Ottoman lines, the effect is immediate. The Ottoman army, already stretched and exhausted after weeks of siege, begins to collapse under the pressure. What had looked like an inevitable victory turns into a chaotic retreat. The siege is broken, Vienna is saved, and in that moment, something much larger shifts. This defeat is not just a battlefield loss, it is a psychological turning point. For the first time in generations, the Ottoman advance into Europe is decisively stopped. The image of unstoppable expansion begins to fade. What matters here is not only that the Ottomans lost Vienna, it is what they lost with it. They lose the initiative. From this point forward, they are no longer the side dictating the pace of conflict in Europe. Instead of advancing, they begin reacting. Instead of expanding, they begin defending. And here is the part that stays with you. They will never again come this close to the heart of Europe. Vienna becomes more than a city. It becomes a line that will not be crossed again. If you step back from the battlefield and look inside the empire itself, you begin to see something far more troubling than any military defeat. Because the real weakness of the Ottoman Empire did not begin at Vienna. It was already growing quietly within its own walls. For centuries, Ottoman rulers were prepared for power in a very different way. Princes were sent out into the provinces, where they governed real territories, made decisions, and learned what it meant to lead. By the time they became sultan, they understood the weight of the empire they were about to inherit. But over time, that system changed. In its place came what is known as the kafes, or the cage. Instead of gaining experience in the outside world, potential heirs were kept inside the palace, often in isolation. They were protected from rivals, but also cut off from reality. When they finally rose to the throne, many had little practical knowledge of governance, diplomacy, or war. And when leadership becomes uncertain, power does not disappear. It shifts. Inside the palace, influence began to concentrate in the hands of court factions. Members of the imperial harem, senior officials, and powerful grand viziers all competed to shape decisions at the highest level. This was not a simple matter of advice or support. It often became a struggle for control, where alliances formed and collapsed behind closed doors. If you imagine being part of that world, you would feel it immediately, not on the battlefield, but in the atmosphere. Decisions delayed, priorities shifting, loyalty becoming conditional. This environment created space for corruption and instability. Officials could rise not because of competence, but because of connections. Policies were influenced by short-term interests rather than long-term strategy. The focus of the state slowly turned inward, toward managing internal rivalries instead of adapting to external challenges. And this is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. Empires rarely fall only because they are defeated from the outside. They fall because they lose their ability to function effectively from within. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was still vast and still powerful on the surface. But beneath that surface, the system that had once made it strong was beginning to weaken. Not through one dramatic event, but through gradual erosion. What you are seeing here is not collapse yet. It is something quieter. An empire starting to lose control of itself. If you were to look at the Ottoman Empire in its prime, one name would stand out above all others. The Janissaries. They were once the most disciplined and feared infantry in the world. Recruited through the Devshirme system, trained from a young age, and completely loyal to the Sultan, they formed the backbone of Ottoman military power. For centuries, they gave the empire a decisive edge on the battlefield. But over time, something began to change. The Janissaries were no longer just soldiers. They became an institution with its own interests, its own influence, and its own voice in politics. Membership gradually expanded beyond its original structure. Discipline weakened. Many became involved in trade and urban life, balancing military roles with personal economic interests. And when reform became necessary, they resisted it. If you place yourself in that moment, you can feel the tension building. The empire is facing new kinds of warfare. European armies are modernizing, experimenting with new tactics, new weapons, and new systems of organization. The battlefield is evolving. But inside the Ottoman system, the very force that once guaranteed victory begins to block change. Attempts to reform the army are met with opposition. In some cases, resistance turns violent. The Janissaries play a role in political unrest, even in the removal of sultans who threaten their position. What was once a pillar of stability becomes a source of instability. And this is where the gap begins to widen. While European powers move toward more modern, flexible military systems, the Ottoman army struggles to adapt. Training falls behind. Technology lags. Command structures become less effective. The difference is not immediate, but it grows with each passing decade. You might not notice it in a single battle, but over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. The same force that once made the empire unstoppable is now holding it back. Not because it lost its past strength overnight, but because it could not evolve with the world around it. And in history, standing still can be just as dangerous as moving backward. If you follow the money, the story becomes even clearer. At its height, the Ottoman Empire sat at the center of global trade. Goods moving between Europe and Asia passed through its Almudden, its ports, its roads. This position brought wealth, stability, and influence. It was not just a military empire, it was an economic crossroads. But the world was changing, and it was changing fast. With the discovery of the Americas and the rise of Atlantic trade routes, the flow of wealth began to shift away from the Mediterranean. European powers like Spain, Portugal, and later Britain and the Netherlands started building new global networks that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. If you were living in the empire at that time, you might not notice the shift immediately. Markets would still be active, cities would still function. But slowly, the streams of revenue that once sustained the state would begin to thin. And unlike its rivals, the Ottoman system struggled to adapt. While Western Europe moved toward industrialization, developing factories, new technologies, and more efficient production, the Ottoman economy remained largely agrarian. Wealth was still tied to land and traditional taxation systems. One of these, known as tax farming, allowed local elites to collect taxes in exchange for upfront payments to the state. In practice, this often led to exploitation. Local power holders focused on extracting as much as possible from the population, rather than investing in long-term growth. Rural communities bore the pressure. Economic inequality deepened, and the central government became increasingly dependent on short-term solutions instead of sustainable reform. Over time, the financial strain became impossible to ignore. By the 19th century, the empire had accumulated significant debt to European creditors. When it could no longer meet its obligations, external control followed. The establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration meant that large parts of the empire's revenue were now managed by foreign interests. Think about what that means. An empire that once controlled the flow of global trade was now losing control over its own finances. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual loss of independence. One decision, one loan, one compromise at a time. And by the time the full weight of that dependency became clear, the empire no longer had the strength to reverse it. Now you begin to see the final pressure building, not just from outside the empire, but from within its own people. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had held together a vast mix of cultures, religions, and ethnic groups. This diversity had once been a strength. Different communities were allowed a degree of autonomy, and for a long time, that balance worked. But by the 19th century, something new was spreading across Europe. Nationalism. The idea that people who shared a language, a culture, or a history should govern themselves began to take hold. And in the Balkans, this idea did not stay theoretical for long. It turned into action. If you were living in regions like Greece, Serbia, or Bulgaria, you would start to see uprisings, revolts, and eventually full wars of independence. These were not isolated events. They were part of a broader shift that the Ottoman system was not designed to contain. And the empire was not facing this challenge alone. Russia, in particular, positioned itself as a protector of Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands. Western European powers also became involved, sometimes supporting independence movements, sometimes pursuing their own strategic interests. The result was constant pressure on multiple fronts, both internal and external. Territory was no longer just being defended, it was being lost. By this point, the empire had gained a new reputation in Europe. It was increasingly referred to as the sick man of Europe, not because it had collapsed, but because it was clearly struggling to survive in a rapidly changing world. And then came the final decision. When World War I began, the Ottoman Empire chose to align with the Central Powers. It was a high-risk move, driven by the hope of regaining strength and influence. There were moments of resilience, including the Adifar of Gallipoli, where Ottoman forces managed to hold back a major Allied campaign. But in the end, the war did not go in their favor. Defeat brought consequences that could not be avoided, Plans were made by the victorious powers to divide the empire's remaining territories. The Treaty of Sèvres proposed a partition that would have dismantled even the Anatolian heartland. If you imagine witnessing this moment, it would feel like the final chapter closing. But history rarely ends cleanly. A resistance movement emerged, led by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. This movement rejected the terms imposed after the war and fought to establish a new foundation. Through conflict and negotiation, a different outcome took shape. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was officially abolished. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, left Constantinople, marking the end of a dynasty that had lasted for more than 600 years. And from that ending, something new was born. The Republic of Turkey. Not an empire, not a continuation, but a transformation. A modern state rising from the remains of a system that could no longer hold together. And if you look back at the long arc from 1683 to this moment, you begin to understand something important. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not a single event. It was a process, one that unfolded slowly, shaped by decisions, pressures, and changes that no empire, no matter how powerful, could ignore forever. If you ask me, the fall of the Ottoman Empire is not just about one battle or one mistake. It is about what happens when a system stops adapting while the world keeps moving. I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think Vienna truly marked the beginning of the end, or was it already too late? Share your view below, and if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, subscribe to When History Broke for more.